Welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Joshua Salmon, and I'm so glad to have you here watching. This is the first episode of From Rebellious to Redeemed, a podcast where I get the chance to sit down with different people and have conversations concerning how they have transitioned from being rebellious in whatever way that showed up in their life to being redeemed in Christ. And so I'm so glad to start this off with a very special guest, my father, apostle, preacher, creative, leader, community leader, all those different things. Apostle and my father, once again, O'Neal Salmon. Glad to have you here.
Yes, put some respect on my name. No, I was just joking.
All right.
Just-
So to get us started, I know that many who will watch this, being that it's the first episode, first episodes are usually supported by your family and friends and stuff like that. But I do believe that somebody will probably be watching who does not necessarily know who you are. So just give some context to who you are, not simply what you do, but who you are.
Hey everyone, again, O'Neal Salmon, proud pastor and father to more so, I'd say, of two wonderful sons and a husband to one wife. Georgia Salmon, whom I've been married to now 26 years, and two sons in that of Joshua and Timothy. I also am the eldest of what is now five children, to that of my parents, both Emerson and Constance Salmon, who are still alive and well. And I'm able to both be a son and serve them in this season of their life as they're in their senior years. I am also a local pastor here in the Tampa Bay area, and I have been pastoring for 20 years. I have been in ministry since the age of 12. Now I'm 48 years of age, so do the math on that. I've been in ministry for some time. Um, I am a local leader beyond the church and a business owner as well. I own a small business. Fair to say, I'm often engaged in a number of things, if at best, but above and beyond it all, even with respect to what I do in the kingdom as far as ministry goes, I do believe ministry starts at home. So I take great joy in being present for my family and loved ones. But at the end of the day, I'm a regular old person, if at best, just really trying to do better at life and live it.
So I think you actually gave us a great place to start with this conversation. Again, as we talk about transitioning from rebelliousness to redeemed and how God has done that, I kind of want to go back to what you brought up with your parents. I would love if you could kind of just give some context to how you were raised, where you were raised, and what your upbringing looked like.
While I reside now in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for a number of years, I'm actually, by origination, I was born in Jamaica, raised by Jamaican parents, came to New York by way of New York, lived there for about 9 years, and now I'm here in Florida. So I've spent most or the majority of my life living here in Florida. You know, as Caribbean household goes, there's a number of things to be said about that because the cultural experience and just the upbringing was in fact different from most Americans today, at least most of the world may not be able to associate with such. And then even more so, the fact that I was raised in, yes, a Caribbean household, but I'd also say there was a great impression on to walk in my faith. And so when in part we're talking about where I am or how I got here today in some way, I definitely say it was because of the fact that I was raised in church. Like many people will attest to, have when they say so, that really does take on different forms. For me, it is really, I was raised in church. I think we were in church more than we were at times at home. Uh, but so that really seeded into who I am today in a great way. Um, while I may have had my parents in my life throughout the majority of my life, like many relationships, it's had its ups and downs, it has its strains and its challenges. There were times where there was a great falling out, and of course, I've watched God restore and bring reconciliation even to that. And where we are today is far from where we've ever been in our interpersonal relationship.
So with that, before we move our plow from that, you mentioned, of course, being raised in a Caribbean household. And I think that when people hear that, of course, there's so much that comes to mind,
Yeah,
whether good or challenging.
it is.
And some would just say straight up bad.
Yeah.
Um, so For you, I would love if you could just uplift, like, what would you say is your fondest memory or value that gained being raised in a Caribbean household? And then also, what would you say was probably the one thing that you're like, if I could get rid of this, and maybe not even get rid of it, but if there is one thing that you're like, hey, I would have preferred this be adjusted, maybe
Yeah.
completely get rid of it, like what's that dichotomy look like?
Wow. Oh man. And like you said, there's so much to be said. Given the fact that I was there in Jamaica, residing in Jamaica, let's say again, for up until the age of 12, much of my childhood at that time was spent in between being at home with my parents and then spending what was the summers and many a Christmases with my grandmother. She's now passed on. But my fondest memories were shared with my grandmother in
Mhm.
turn because it allowed for the liberty of really roaming free and just taking advantage of what many would expect a summer experience to be like. For us, it was a great excursion. It was the ability to roam the country. By the way, she lived in the country, and as opposed to where we lived, which was in a city or rural area. I think what I appreciate then and there, and it may actually be the thing that I also, in some way, uh, may have grown at different points in my life to kind of be challenged with at the same time, and I might have even at some point saw it as a negative too, is I grew up quickly. I grew up quickly because I was the eldest. I grew up quickly because I had many responsibilities imposed upon me. Because while, yes, my parents were present, they had tedious schedules to maintain. And unlike today, where you have a great many outlets, children back then, it didn't have much in part. So for me, when I did entertain the summers with my grandmother, it really felt like it was an unburdening of those degrees of responsibilities, taking care of, so the audience is more aware. Maybe some of the responsibilities would be taking care of my siblings and, of course, the household when my parents weren't present. And again, just being that person in part to be responsible for any oversight of whatever was going on. So the negative kind of comes into that in some degree for me as well, because yes, just imagine that you have to grow up quickly, but at the same time, you're taking on responsibilities that you're not really sure are your own and you don't necessarily know if you're doing all too well at it. You just suppose that because maybe you aren't being corrected as much then and all is well. And I say corrected as much, that's not necessarily mean that we weren't children. But I'm talking about with respect to the responsibility itself. You wonder, how well are you really doing in that? I think some parts of my growing up, I might have even felt, and I do recall feeling at times, like I missed some parts of my childhood, in that because you had to assert yourself and insert yourself as a leader. And needless to say, I mean, even ministry, I got into I may have said this already at the age of 12. You're talking about now, not just ministry, but leadership at
Yeah,
12.
yeah.
So, yeah.
So let's talk about that, right? So, and I'm glad that we got a chance to establish kind of your upbringing and background because I do think that a lot of times the things that we see manifest later in rebellion or later in challenges with obedience to God tend to stem from things that began in those earlier years or seeds that were planted in those earlier years. And while I think many would share a lot of appreciation or even admonishment for you being so young and being in ministry and like leadership, as we mentioned, right, those things come with weight. And so my question to you would be, how would you say at that time you coped with the weights that you were carrying? And if not at that time, how did you find later yourself having to? How did that manifest? How did those things? Because again, these things that sit within us, I don't believe, and maybe you can share if you feel different, but I don't believe they just sit and just stay seated. Eventually, they choose to stand up and remind us that they're present. So, kind of, how did that show up, say, at that time or
Yeah.
later on in your life?
I mean, again, I'm 48, so to remember everything,
Yeah.
and how fresh those experiences may be today for me, at least those memories, they're not as fresh.
Mhm.
But I do recall many a times, especially into my teenage years, embracing what is known today as FOMO, fear of missing out. I can't help but to ponder on the fact that while I did have leadership responsibilities just around the corner or, within view, I would watch my peers, enjoying the lack of responsibilities,
Yeah.
so to speak, and the freedom that came with that. And I say freedom meaning the lack of responsibilities presents a sense of freedom. When you have the weight of not just the responsibility, but the accountability in turn, it causes you to have to again mount up in a way that really puts a mindset in a space where you have to know that the buck stops with you and much is dependent on you.
Yeah.
That weight in itself, managing life, by the way, managing being a kid, managing going to school, managing the relationships, even relationships themselves were challenging for me because I was so engulfed and entrenched in the idea of I've got to play this role and do this in respect to responsibility. While it was challenging, it also became my outlet. I saw relationships with the opposite sex more so as a means to make up for what I didn't have in other spaces. Mind you, again, while my parents were actively in my life as providers and
How would you say at that time you coped with the weights that you were carrying? And if not at that time, how did you find later yourself having to? How did that manifest? How did those things? Because again, these things that sit within us, I don't believe, and maybe you can share if you feel different, but I don't believe they just sit and just stay seated. Eventually, they choose to stand up and remind us that they're present. So, kind of, how did that show up, say, at that time or
yeah.
later on in your life?
I mean, again, I'm 48, so to remember everything,
Yeah.
and how fresh those experiences may be today for me, at least those memories, they're not as fresh.
Mhm.
But I do recall many a times, especially into my teenage years, embracing what is known today as FOMO, fear of missing out. I can't help but to ponder on the fact that while I did have leadership responsibilities just around the corner or, within view, I would watch my peers, enjoying the lack of responsibilities,
Yeah.
so to speak, and the freedom that came with that. And I say freedom meaning the lack of responsibilities presents a sense of freedom. When you have the weight of not just the responsibility, but the accountability in turn, it causes you to have to again mount up in a way that really puts a mindset in a space where you have to know that the buck stops with you and much is dependent on you.
Yeah.
That weight in itself, managing life, by the way, managing being a kid, managing going to school, managing the relationships, even relationships themselves were challenging for me because I was so engulfed and entrenched in the idea of I've got to play this role and do this in respect to responsibility. Caregivers, and they loved me. I knew that. I didn't know how necessarily to communicate, nor did we have the opportunity many times. And I say so not because they censored us, but the time and space that we lived in are to that time. And it is kids are to be seen and not heard. So that was a message
Yeah.
that was,
Culturally.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, playing in your mind always. And
How would you say at that time you coped with the weights that you were carrying? And if not at that time, how did you find later yourself having to? How did that manifest? How did those things? Because again, these things that sit within us, I don't believe, and maybe you can share if you feel different, but I don't believe they just sit and just stay seated. Eventually, they choose to stand up and remind us that they're present. So, kind of, how did that show up, say, at that time or
yeah.
later on in your life?
I mean, again, I'm 48, so to remember everything,
Yeah.
and how fresh those experiences may be today for me, at least those memories, they're not as fresh.
Mhm.
But I do recall many a times, especially into my teenage years, embracing what is known today as FOMO, fear of missing out. I can't help but to ponder on the fact that while I did have leadership responsibilities just around the corner or, within view, I would watch my peers, enjoying the lack of responsibilities,
Yeah.
so to speak, and the freedom that came with that. And I say freedom meaning the lack of responsibilities presents a sense of freedom. When you have the weight of not just the responsibility, but the accountability responsibility in turn, it causes you to have to again mount up in a way that really puts a mindset in a space where you have to know that the buck stops with you and much is dependent on you. That weight in itself, managing life, by the way, managing being a kid, managing going to school, managing the relationships, even relationships themselves were challenging for me because I was so engulfed and entrenched in the idea of I've got to play this role and do this in respect to responsibility. So if you had anything to express, it was best you hold it in, at least not express it to the people closest to you. And I don't know if I fear judgment. I just know.
How would you say at that time you coped with the weights that you were carrying? And if not at that time, how did you find later yourself having to? How did that manifest? How did those things? Because again, these things that sit within us, I don't believe, and maybe you can share if you feel different, but I don't believe they just sit and just stay seated. Eventually, they choose to stand up and remind us that they're present. So, kind of, how did that show up, say, at that time or
Yeah.
later on in your life?
I mean, again, I'm 48, so to remember everything,
Yeah.
and how fresh those experiences may be today for me, at least those memories, they're not as fresh.
Mhm.
But I do recall many a times, especially into my teenage years, embracing what is known today as FOMO, fear of missing out. I can't help but to ponder on the fact that while I did have leadership responsibilities just around the corner or, within view, I would watch my peers, enjoying the lack of responsibilities,
Yeah.
so to speak, and the freedom that came with that. And I say freedom meaning the lack of responsibilities presents a sense of freedom. When you have the weight of not just the responsibility, but the accountability in turn, it causes you to have to again mount up in a way that really puts a mindset in a space where you have to know that the buck stops with you and much is dependent on you.
Yeah.
That weight in itself, managing life, by the way, managing being a kid, managing going to school, managing the relationships, even relationships themselves were challenging for me because I was so engulfed and entrenched in the idea of I've got to play this role and do this in respect to responsibility. There was not a sense of freedom in that. So I saw through relationships to express my love, to express my care. That also led to a lot of challenges down the road. But that was my outlet. And I think I grew up quite quickly, even in that space,
Mhm.
as a result of that.
Okay, so I definitely want us to come back to the relationship part. I'm putting a note on that because I think you just started touching on a lot that was good there. Something that I did want to highlight real quick, and I had to take a moment and type it while you said it because I thought it was so good, was you said that you were managing the weight of responsibility and accountability. As an English teacher, these words stick out to me because I'm always thinking about the denotation and the connotation of a word, right? So what a word actually means, but also what a word makes us feel. And when you look at the denotations of those words, while they're close, while they're adjacent in meaning, some would say synonyms, they're not the same.
Right.
Responsibility and accountability are not the same. I'm not going to make you dive necessarily into that difference because I feel like that's a whole message and sermon in itself. But my
And it could
question,
be.
and it really could be. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
whole leadership workshop right there.
Yeah.
But my question to you, and I think this will still nonetheless probably give some of the same framing around young leaders, right? So I'm 24. For those in my generation, we talked about generations, funny enough, yesterday, right? So those in Gen Z and under, and you can even, if you want, we can give this to millennials too. Is looking at that age gap, what would be your advice to those who are managing the weight of responsibility but lacking accountability? And or what would be your advice to those, again, in this age group who are managing the weight of accountability, meaning they feel the accountability to Christ, accountability to those around them, but maybe lacking opportunity to hold responsibility to see it through? And I ask that just for some framing because I think many of us do find ourselves in positions where we're might maybe on one end of the spectrum where we feel super responsible and we're serving in our churches and we're serving in ministry in our communities and on our job, yet we lack the community to hold us accountable, or maybe even the biblical grounding, in relational grounding with God to hold us accountable, or whatever that looks like. And or we're in spaces where we feel these weight, we feel the call, we feel the accountability. And so in our secret place, we're praying and we're fasting and reading the
Yeah.
word and all these different things. But it can kind of feel like in the world around you, it's not manifesting to
Mhm.
much to actually feel like maybe you're stewarding something. What would
Yeah.
be your advice to that?
Okay, so let's reel back to what you said before, which was so true, and it's needful that we, I guess, draw a conclusion on the definition because it can take several forms depending on what it is that we're talking about. And that's the distinction between what is a responsibility and what is, the matter of accountability. Just really simple form, I would say that responsibility is what I'm assigned to do. What am I assigned to do? So I think of responsibility in that sense. When I think of accountability, I think of who am I answerable for? Now, if I go from that perspective, let's consider again the framework of the question asked. Managing without responsibility, right? First of all, I'm a leader. And in being a leader, I know that I have at the end of the day, influence to which I have to steward well.
Mm,
Because at the end of the day, I'm accountable for not just what I say, but also what I do. I'm assigned to be influential. I'm assigned to impart. I'm assigned to instruct. I'm assigned to guide. I'm assigned to lead. Clear to me ought to be my audience. Who am I assigned to? Those are the once I identify that, that's who I'm responsible to. When I think of what I'm answerable for, I'm answerable for how I perform, how I interact, how I engage, how I live life, how I impact. That's important. If I'm talking about my own personal walk, then I have to regard that I'm charged to lead myself. I
mm,
am charged to lead myself and lead well in that because at the end of the day, not only am I responsible for my own soul salvation, I mean, the Bible says it, clearly work out your salvation with fear and tremble. It did not assign it to anyone else but to you to
yeah,
do that.
personal.
So I can't make anyone else responsible for my personal development and my accountability. I have to make myself accountable in essence, in not only to God, but if I am aligned with anyone else, I have to ensure that I maintain what relationship I have so that I can ensure that, there's accountability there if there need be accountability. Now, some things I consider that I'm accountable for, my integrity, my character, my truth, and that might align somewhat with integrity in some ways as well. But I am accountable for such. I'm accountable for my attitude, my behavior. That's me. I may be influenced by everything around me to some degree, but at the end of the day, I get a choice in that.
Mm,
So I have to be careful. Now, I'm concerned for leaders, and maybe I take it this way. I'm concerned for leaders that assume responsibility but no accountability. I think that's dangerous.
mhm.
I think that's dangerous because while you recognize what you're assigned to do, you're not always, when there's no accountability, you almost position yourself in such a way that you become answerable to no one. Even if answerable means I answer to the crowd that I'm accountable or responsible for,
Yeah, yeah.
um, or in the case of a church and a church organizational structure, do you even have a board? Do you have peers that hold you accountable and that you feel in turn accountable to? Even those that are investors know that there is symbiotic or need for relationship with those that they're investing into, and vice versa. Those who are being invested in know that they have some accountability to the investor. I got to steward the grace, and I think about it in that light. I have to steward the authority that's been given as well. I think today we set ourselves up again for danger when we assume leadership, or better yet, we exert leadership in whatever capacity we do, and we only consider responsibilities without accountability. Now, flip of that would be you have accountability, meaning you feel answerable to, but you haven't yet assumed or been given, in some cases as well, responsibility.
Yeah.
I think that too can be dangerous because now you're answerable for something you have no ability to change. And I think that's where the
Yeah.
frustration of this present generation lies greatly is you're being held accountable
Hmm.
for something that you had no
Yeah, yeah,
responsibility.
yeah.
You didn't create it. You just walked right into it. And unfortunately, that generations like my own or generations even to prior, because that generation still exists in turn. We are all inheriting in some way the prior generations' problems and in some ways the promises too. Because if we think about the promises of Abraham, there's so many you all get to inherit aspects of
Yeah.
that too. Yeah, I hope I answered the question. That was a loaded one. I think there's
No,
so many ways, like I said, to
okay.
dissect that.
Yeah, I think that alone could have been the topic of this whole thing. So that's why I was like, we don't need, but there's no way we're gonna get all the layers of that
Yeah.
question answered. But I do think that you landed in a great place, and I kind of want to shift us, and I feel like it would help to shift us in
Mhm.
here because you talked about the concept of the danger around holding levels of accountability, right, without feeling like you actually have the responsibility. And I do believe that that's a burden that our generation faces, due to, again, being inheritors of whatever cultural and societal norms were created, right, before
Yeah.
we were born. So with that being said, I think that one of the levels of accountability that I can speak for myself, and I think that some other Black men may feel this, that we find ourselves accountable for in the space of relationships is the trauma and the misuse, the abuse, both emotional and physical, that have taken place in relationships, especially specifically talking about Black relationships as well, in our
Right.
culture. I think the thing that we have inherited is the narratives, right? Is the fears that our women have, and that we also have, right? The fear-based mindsets, the mindsets of how we're supposed to show up, the mindsets of how we're supposed to perform, how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to be perceived. I would love to kind of talk to you about, if you can go back a little bit. Again, I know you've been married for some time now, but even maybe even thinking at, engagement or dating, right, prior to actually being married. How did you balance and how did you interact with societal pressures and what society had as normalities concerning relationship? And how did you balance that both in the good and the bad of how you performed in yours, say with, of course, mom or even relationships prior, if you can remember? How did you balance that? What were your highlights and what were your lowlights in that?
Well, just to be clear, just in case your mom is watching this, there was nobody before her.
All right, so let's just pause there. Young men, what just happened is we need to go take notes. That is called experience. All right, let's go ahead and write that down.
There was nobody.
You're absolutely right.
Before
Absolutely
her.
right.
In fact, from the womb to being a groom. That's it. From the womb
Before your
to
mother
being
knew
a
you
groom.
and after your mother knew you, that was the only woman who knew you.
That's it. Yeah, as I mentioned, there was relationships. There's different degrees of relationships. There's the platonic, romantic, and the romantic sometimes tethers with it, whether or not it became sexual and or not. There are different degrees of relationship. I have experienced them all prior to, being married. Now, with that being said, each one of those relationships may have impacted me differently, and would impact any of us to whatever degree differently. Now, if I were to regard what they meant to me, I think they, in many ways, filled what was a void or a need that I may not even have identified. I don't believe I identified then, but as I matured, I became quite acquainted with the fact that these relationships served to fulfill a void along the way. Whether the void was having someone to be able to talk with and really unburden my heart or share a thought or two, because while my parents were present, they were not as active. Now, I do not demonize them or put them in any negative a light intentionally, because the truth of the matter is back then parents never assumed the degree of conversations that I see now happening, the degree of conversations you and I have had or you're experiencing with us as parents, and I've seen even other parents experience today with their children. Children did not necessarily have a voice, like I said, in the room. So that was the culture. That was
Yeah.
what was customary. So when you don't have that, you seek other means to share. And sometimes those avenues take you into unhealthy spaces. So there were a great many relationships that were unhealthy in that. How I encroached upon them, I think I didn't go after any one in particular with, at least majority anyway. I didn't go after it with the idea of, oh, I need to fill a void here, and so let me get into a relationship. It might have been a shared experience that brought us closer, or some, that we found as a common interest, and so that conversation spurned there. And of course, you always have the physical attraction that plays into it. And again, not all relationships are equal in part, but when that became the matter, I also realized that even that too at times presented challenges, because when you are only physically drawn and connected in that light, when that fades and that's no longer of importance, and attitudes and the mentalities and you know goals and just really, are you all in respect to even your faith? When you realize that you're not walking in agreement, I promise you, people don't look pretty anymore. Not to the degree, that you're willing to accommodate. You just start realizing you see the ugly more than you see the pretty, you know. And that causes you to realize just how distasteful, life can be, especially in unhealthy relationships and such. But then here's what I would say came about. While I did not necessarily, and I hope that one is perceiving that I'm putting all of that on people, sometimes that is on you. You see you now through those relationships. You see how you're responding in part, and you're like, the ugly is not in them always, it's sometimes in you, and how how can two walk together except there be an agreement? All of a sudden now, something about them causes you to act out of character, as causes you to maneuver in such a way that you even compromise. I remember compromising my faith and my convictions so many times over, not for nothing else than I allowed that person in to a space that honestly I gave them sanction to operate, but it was a violation of my relationship with God. It was a violation of my relationship even with myself, and what I held dear to. So you start realizing how much of you there is still room for development. Talk about going from relationship to relationship, perhaps seeking and searching. What I do know at the end of the day, I found no peace until I found Christ
Mm.
for myself. And that might be different from other people's perspective on their search and such, but I promise you, there was no contentment until I came to the end of my pursuit and said, God, you choose.
Whew. That's good. That's good.